It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Been waiting for this one. We've got serious news, got some big aviation news, and we've got our expert back on the show. It's Captain John Cox. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Safety Operating Systems. Captain Cox is a 49-year aviation veteran, 14,000 flight hours, 20-plus years as an airline captain, instructor, and test pilot. He's a recognized aviation expert really around the world, and he's an author, and he's on NBC all the time, the aviation analyst there, and he writes a column, Ask the Captain, for USA Today, which you all may have seen. Most importantly to me, he's a friend of podcast by George. Captain, welcome back to the PBG.
Good to see you, George. Thanks for having me back on.
Well, we got a lot of things to talk about. Let me go ahead and bring this one up on screen here with any luck. This just in the past week or so caught my attention, caught the national news. The Percy Priest plane crash, they're calling it. What to know about the deadly accident that killed Christian diet guru Gwen Shamblin Laura. The 7 people killed in that plane crash on Percy Priest Lake in Smyrna, Tennessee, were all leaders at Remnant Fellowship Church in Brentwood. The group was traveling to a Women Fighting for America event in Stuart, Florida. According to the organization's founder, authorities said the Cessna 500 series plane that crashed was headed from Smyrna to Palm Beach International Airport. I wanted to skip down here to someone the captain undoubtedly knows. NTSB spokesperson Eric Weiss estimated it would be 2 weeks before a preliminary investigation report is released. The full investigation, including a probable cause of the crash, may take 1 to 2 years. Okay, so let's jump out of that real quick. I guess that was my first question, Captain. You've seen a lot of these investigations. They come up with this preliminary report in a couple of weeks sometimes. Is it usually more accurate and conclusive than one might think, or do you really have to wait for the full details a year or so out?
You really have to wait for the full details because the preliminary will only give you the facts that they have up to that point. There's no analysis. There's no component testing results. There's no probable cause. So it is really just a recitation of the airplane, the paperwork, or that they were able to look at for the paperwork, the qualifications of the crew, and literally what they know up to that point without doing any analysis or drawing any conclusions. So the full report, which is 1 to 2 years out, it will have a lot more information in it.
I'm talking about this plane now. Let's bring this up on screen. I want to show this. I've got a nice look at that. All right, this is the crash of Cessna 501 citation. This is from the Bureau of Aircraft Accident Archives. There's a look at the plane. I don't know. I'm just a layman, Captain. When I look at that plane, I see a really nice plane. I mean, that's a very sleek, aerodynamically. That looks like a good plane to me. It's particularly too good to crash. But what's your experience with this particular aircraft?
Well, it's interesting, George, because this was one of the models of jets that I flew very early in my career. The 501 was actually very popular beginning in the 70s. And it's an older Cessna citation, but it's a very solid airplane to fly. And it performs well. I mean, my experience with it was very, very good. Cessna designed a really good airplane in the 500 series Cessna citations.
Wow. Now, for somebody like me, I'd look at that and say, well, that's a Learjet. Now, it's not a Lear brand, but is that what a layman would call a Learjet?
People call it any small jet a Learjet. This is significantly different than the Lear. It's a straight wing. It's slower than the Learjet. It's easier to fly than a Learjet. But this airplane, it has a lot of the handling characteristics that Cessna is so known for, which is it's stable, it's a good instrument platform, it's got plenty of power, and it's an airplane that pilots enjoy flying.
And let me bring this back up. And scroll down here to some of the basic details that the captain's familiar with at this point. The aircraft departed Smyrna Rutherford County Airport. Captain, where is that? It's in Tennessee, right?
Right, it's in Tennessee, not terribly far from Nashville.
Okay. Runway 32, with 6 passengers and 1 pilot on board. After takeoff, the aircraft entered a right turn and climbed to 2,900 feet when it lost height and descended to 1,800 feet before climbing again to 3,000 feet. It then entered an uncontrolled descent and crashed in the Percy Priest Lake, which I had never heard of. That's about 5 kilometers east of the airport. All 7 occupants were killed, among them the American actor Joe Lara, age 58, who I wasn't familiar with either, but that's a no, never mind. Well, back to you, Captain, and I know you would be the last to speculate on something like this, but I looked at that and I thought, in my limited knowledge, 7 passengers, small plane, I don't know how many, it might carry about that number of people. I start thinking about weight, on a plane like that, and weight displacement. Is that where your mind runs or not?
I don't. No, the airplane will carry it. It's certificated for 8 people, and it'll carry that pretty easily. And with 2 engines operating, it's got plenty of power. So the number of people on board didn't really cause me much concern. The flight path tells me that there's abnormalities going on, whether it is a control problem itself, meaning a flight control problem, or whether the pilot is getting disoriented, because the last part of the flight is consistent with what you see in loss of control in flight accidents, where you get a real steep turn and a very rapid increase in the descent rate. So that's something that NTSB is certainly going to look at, but it's a tragedy in every sense of the word.
Well, and you're all knowledgeable about this particular plane and its history. I would assume that it's very good as far as safety is concerned. Has overall weight, not necessarily passengers, but cargo, is that ever been an issue with this plane before?
You can overload any airplane, and this one, I don't know that they have run the weight and balance calculations yet. They will, but even, and I'm not suggesting that it was, but even if it were at its maximum gross weight or slightly above, with 2 engines operating, the airplane's going to perform very well. This is a very stable airplane. The wings, it's not the fastest of the jets out there, but because of that, it has some additional stability, and it makes it easier to fly for the pilots. So this is a type of airplane that people entering the jet market, particularly in the 70s and 80s, this would be a jet that they would go to.
Now, 2 engines, as you mentioned, and it's in its ascent, critical time for power, but I would assume that this plane is capable of taking off with 1 engine, correct?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Any of the airplanes that you get on, the larger airplanes, certainly any airliner, is certificated to fly with an engine and operative. So, and pilots train for that a lot. So if an engine does fail, you're gonna return for landing fairly quickly. But the airplane is totally capable of flying safely on 1 engine.
And 1 pilot, that's common also, correct?
With the smaller jets, it is common to have a single pilot, somewhat like the turboprops are oftentimes single pilot.
And for this model and this age of aircraft, what would be the status of recorders on board?
If it has any recorders on board, they're going to be very rudimentary. This airplane, I think, was built in the early 80s, so I don't think that they're going to have much success with recorders.
You talk about rudimentary. Eye and ear witnesses, they're not to be discounted when it comes to investigations like this. I would assume that they're wanting to talk to people that saw and heard what was going on when this happened.
Absolutely. The investigators are going to look at the radar data. They're going to look at the forensic evidence out of the airplane. In other words, how it impacted the water. Were there any things that shouldn't have been there that are, or they would be expected to be there that aren't there? And then they're also going to talk to eyewitnesses and try to piece together as much as they can what happened in those last couple of minutes of flight.
Well, that's my series of questions on this particular tragic incident. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, it's a matter, and this is a hard thing for people, but be patient. Let the NTSB, who is very good at this, let them do the job, and then wait for the report, and that will answer the questions.
All right, very good. I wanted to talk about another topic here, and it actually was the original reason that I had reached out. It was just before this accident. It's because of a lot of reporting that we're seeing, and I'm going to bring that up on screen. Okay, this was an article, again, this is out of the USA Today network that the captain writes for. This says a Southwest Airlines passenger who allegedly struck flight attendant charged with felony battery. A Southwest Airlines flight attendant was assaulted by a passenger over the weekend, lost 2 teeth, according to a letter the flight attendant union sent to the airline CEO Monday in an appeal for more safeguards as travel rebounds. This past weekend, one of our flight attendants was seriously assaulted, resulting in injuries in the face and a loss of 2 teeth. Lynn Montgomery, president of TWU Local 556, said in the letter, "Unfortunately, this is just one of many occurrences. I write to you today because we cannot tolerate our beloved cohorts being abused in such a manner, and because I am asking for your help and leadership in ending these travesties." Okay, Captain. We're hearing a lot about these types of incidents on planes of late. Like with a lot of things, there's always been some history of just about everything. That's why they call it history. What's your experience with unruly passengers and problems on board, and is it becoming something that we've got to deal with in ways that we never have before?
It is a very serious problem, George, and it's growing. Part of it has been the requirement for people wearing masks, and this puts the flight crew, notably the flight attendants, in a really difficult position. They're asked to enforce a federal rule. They have to do that. They didn't make the rule, but they can't give you or give someone dispensation not to follow the rule. And as people get more and more belligerent, and alcohol is oftentimes involved, but as they get more belligerent, it becomes very quickly that a matter for security. And I have had the requirement to remove several passengers off of flights that I flew. It's no longer, when it gets to the captain, it's generally no longer a matter of discussion. It's a matter of how we're going to resolve it. And that is with the police, and that passenger is going to get off. Now, they have a choice. They can fight with the police and go off in handcuffs, or they can go acquiesce to the requirement to get off of the airplane peacefully. That's the only choices that they have. 2 things are important to understand. The captain has the authority to have a passenger removed. No matter that you have a ticket in your hand, if you read the fine print in the ticket, it's for common carriage. And under the law, if you present a threat in the mind of the captain, you are or could be a threat to the flight. That captain has the right and the responsibility to have you removed, and law enforcement will take the request of a captain to have them removed. There are several states that have laws about this, but more importantly, the federal government, meaning the FBI, U.S. Marshals, they have authority under federal law to remove and prosecute. And with the recently, the FAA has also stepped in. Administrator Dixon has said that the FAA will also be a federal agency that will prosecute violators with very significant fines. I am 100% in support of very harsh penalties for people who are unruly in an aircraft. We work too hard at aviation safety, George, to let a few people compromise all the efforts of all the many, many thousands of professionals that provide a safe transportation system.
Well, that kind of gets to the big question that I had. Those unruly people, I don't know that they're thinking about those things. I don't know that they're thinking much at all. But my immediate question or my observation is, and I flew a lot back in my days when I was in the marketing world, I don't want the captain or the co-pilot or anybody up there having to think or worry about something that some yahoo is doing back here in the passenger cabin. I want them to be thinking about flying the airplane. I'm sure you'd agree with that.
Absolutely. If you're in flight and you have an unruly passenger, that now you're looking at a diversion, and that dramatically increases the workload on the crew. You're advising air traffic control. You're declaring an emergency. You're now having to prepare to have law enforcement meet the airplane when it gets to the gate. There's a lot of things that have to go on. And you really increase the workload on all of the crew. The flight attendants are the front line with this issue. And the captain must trust the judgment of the flight attendants. These ladies and gentlemen that are our flight attendants, they're professionals, they're highly trained, but they've also got a lot of experience in defusing situations. So when I would ever get a call and it said, "Hey, John, we've got a real problem back here with a passenger," my absolute belief is the flight attendants have done everything they can to de-escalate the situation, and I'm going to back the crew members up, and that person's going to get off the airplane.
Yeah, and they're part of the team, and you always go with your team. The other quick question was air marshals. Can they help? Is that a possible solution? More air marshals, or that's just not practical?
Well, the number of flights we have versus the number of air marshals, it means that you're not going to have an air marshal on every flight or every fifth flight or whatever. If they're on board, then they can and many times have stepped in and been of assistance. Any law enforcement officer, the crews know if there's law enforcement officers on board, and they will quickly go and enlist the aid of a trained law enforcement officer if the situation can't be defused.
Well, and as always, I appreciate you coming on the podcast. Before we lose you today, and it seems like we always talk about very heavy issues. My God, these things are very serious, tragic in many incidents, and I know that's a better part of your life. Had something that's not necessarily lighthearted, but maybe not as deadly serious anyway, and that's UFOs. We just had Mick West on Podcast by George. He's the head of metabunk.org, and he was debunking some of these UFO videos that everybody's so excited about. The UFOs are reported a lot of times by military pilots, but also commercial pilots have experienced the UFO phenomenon. And you're many years in the cockpit. Do you have a UFO story that you share with folks?
Well, after flying airplanes for 50 years, I've seen things while flying that I couldn't immediately identify. Does that make it an unidentified flying object? Well, by the literal definition, it does. I have seen no little green men. But I have, you see things that turn out to be a satellite or a star. Venus can be very bright sometimes, and it can appear to be another airplane or another object. It's not. It's the planet Venus. But I have talked to pilots that have seen things that they couldn't identify. As far as have we seen evidence of alien arrival? No, I've not seen any of it, nor has any pilot that I know ever seen anything like that.
I've got my own little story to share, and you talk about getting in the Wayback Machine. It's a long time ago, folks. I'm a teenager almost in a small town here in the heartland, and one Saturday night we were bored and we crawled up on the roof of a commercial building, one of the few in this small town, me and two buddies, and we're up there on this roof just looking around, kind of looking at the stars, and then all of a sudden off the horizon comes these string of lights, and it moves from one horizon right over our heads and goes to the other horizon, and I don't know, it lasted maybe a minute to make that trip. And I remember saying there's three guys up there looking at this, and I said, "Did you see that?" The other guy says, "Yeah." The other guy says, I didn't see anything. And if I'm asked, I'm going to say I didn't see anything, but we saw it. And what it was, I don't know. I've looked it up on the internet, and I think it may have been something similar to a Starlink series of satellites or something. I don't know. But anyway, that's my UFO story. Well, Captain, I really appreciate you coming on. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I said that, there's things that, we see high-speed airplanes that are reported later, many years later, as experimental airplanes in certain parts of the country or the world. And those, I think, contribute to things that move quickly and in directions that people don't expect. Technology moves forward, and the military is always experimenting with new things, not only our military, but others. So I think there are more questions than there are answers, but I have yet to see any little green men.
I didn't see any little green men either. Captain, before we lose you here, give us a little closer here. If folks that want to follow you, they can see you in your column in the USA Today, about contact you, those types of things.
If there's an aviation incident, typically I'll come up on NBC News. I'm their aviation analyst. You can reach me through the USA Today web link. I read all of the questions that I get. And in some cases, if you have a particular issue, I'm more than happy. If you'll give me contact information, I'm more than happy to reach back out to you and answer a question. I've done that a lot of times for fearful flyers that would like to have a one-on-one dialogue, and I'm glad to help.
That's great. Captain, thanks again for coming on Podcast by George.
Good to see you, George.
Folks, that's on the Podcast by George live line. That's Captain John Cox. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Safety Operating Systems. He's the NBC aviation analyst, as he mentioned, and author of Ask the Captain in USA Today. And folks, if you like Podcast by George, please do what I recommend. Follow us on Facebook, like us on YouTube, leave a comment there, subscribe. All of those things help the podcast get more distribution and get out there so folks can see people like Captain Cox. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up for this particular edition anyway. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another Podcast by George.